Bob and Alice review my liberal bias in generative AI paper V2. Here is another of my Bob and Alice audio and text videos, this time focused on a MS Word .docs file that was passed into the NotebookLM AI by Google. I get the sense that NotebookLM is a better version of Google's generative AI, the research smarts behind generic Google searches. See the source video, Liberal Bias in the Google product of generative AI in this playlist. I am becoming increasingly impressed with the AI synthetically generated voices of Bob and Alice and the degree of smarts present in their review analysis commentary. I am observing that the commentary uses content outside of the material that I present. It would seem that the NotebookLM AI is growing in general intelligence over time. Do enjoy, like, subscribe, and share with others.
Have you ever asked an AI, a seemingly simple question, and gotten back something that just felt off? Maybe even a bit like it was lecturing you.
Oh, absolutely. It happens more often than you might think. And it's fascinating how these AI responses can sometimes, reveal more than just the data. They can hint at underlying assumptions, maybe even biases.
Yeah, or at least what some people perceive as biases. And as these systems get smarter, understanding that becomes really important.
Definitely critical.
That's exactly what we're getting into today. We're doing a deep dive into some really interesting recent observations. It's all about what one individual perceived as a liberal bias in Google's generative AI.
Right, and our source material here is a collection of personal experiments and thoughts put together on July 2nd, 2025 by a researcher, Alan Lee Whiteman.
So our mission today is to unpack his perspective. We'll look at the specific AI queries he tried, the, surprising answers he got back.
And how all that prompted him to think about these much bigger conversations happening in society, about sex, gender, the political divide in the U.S.
Exactly. And we'll approach this just by looking at his observations, his connections. We're presenting his findings to you, not taking sides, just exploring what he documented.
Right. Impartially laying out what the source material says.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Our author, Whiteman, wakes up from a dream. This is late June 2025.
Yeah, with this clear idea.
Right. He felt encouraged to test Google's AI on this reported bias. So he types in a specific query. Give them an inch and they will take a mile versus there are only two sexes. What was that first response like?
Well, it wasn't what he expected at all. He described it as basically a page of lecture. It seemed designed to, quote, castigate me for asking a sexist or misogynistic question.
Wow, strong stuff right off the bat.
Yeah. He apparently gave it a thumbs down in the interface, explained why. But unfortunately, he couldn't grab the exact text of that first interaction. Still, it definitely set a tone.
It really did. So the author then gives some context for why he asked that specific question from his perspective.
Right. He points out the phrase, there are only two sexes, is a direct reference to President Trump's announcement back on January 20th, 2025.
And he says he largely agrees with that stance.
Mostly, yeah. He mentions having some quibbles, which, we can get into later, but generally he aligns with it.
Okay. And the other part, the idiom. Give them an inch and they will take a mile.
He presents that as a distinctly conservative observation. His view is that it reflects how past compromises with what he terms the left have led to the, quote, left progressive camp boosting their LGBTQ cohort as a significant element in the party of the offended.
So for him, that boosting is the taking a mile part of the idiom.
That's how he frames it, yes. It's his interpretation of that dynamic.
Okay, so after that initial pretty forceful response from the AI, he tried to replicate the query, right, to see if it would happen again.
Exactly. He used a different computer, a VPN, an incognito browser session, trying to isolate variables.
And what did he find? Were the responses the same?
No, they were quite different, actually. This led him to observe that, in his words, AI is learning on the fly.
Interesting. So what were these different responses?
Well, the first requery he managed to screenshot just gave a pretty standard message. Something like, it looks like there aren't many great matches for your search.
Okay, kind of a non-answer.
Right. Followed by a link to an Australian site, Online Opinion. So pretty generic.
And the second attempt?
That one was stranger. It cited a web page called lolcow.farm and showed a bunch of images.
Lolcow Farm? What's that?
His interpretation was that it's like a gossip board for people who rant about things online, maybe without realizing others are laughing at them, sort of using them as fodder.
Huh. So definitely not a standard academic or news source being pulled there.
Not at all. And these varying results really highlight something, don't they? How sensitive these AIs are. Change the prompt slightly, use incognito mode.
And you get potentially very different information from very different corners of the web.
Exactly. It shows how fluid and complex these AI interpretations can be. They draw from this vast, sometimes messy pool of online data.
Right. Okay, so after those initial kind of inconsistent and surprising results, he simplifies things. He just searches for one part of the original phrase, give them an inch. What happened then?
Well, this time he got what he described as a very straightforward, reasonable answer. Just a clear definition of the proverb.
Like a dictionary definition.
Pretty much. Covered the meaning, context, connotation, the idea of boundaries.
Yeah.
Even listed alternatives like take a yard or take an L.
And crucially,
He noted, this response had no lecturing stance. It was just neutral information.
Okay, so a real contrast to that first interaction he described. But then he tried mixing them again, slightly differently. Comment on there are only two sexes and give them an inch and they will take a yard. Did the lecture come back?
It did. He described this response as having a very different lecturing stance, even an apparent parent-to-child attitude.
So what did it say this time? About there are only two sexes.
The AI stated that phrase oversimplifies biological sex. It mentioned it doesn't account for variations like intersex conditions.
Okay.
And it stressed the difference between biological sex chromosomes, hormones, anatomy, and gender, which we'll call a social and cultural construct.
And its conclusion on that phrase.
That using it can be harmful to individuals who do not identify within the binary. Pretty direct.
Very direct. And how did it link that to the give them an inch idiom?
It explained the idiom as expressing a fear of, quote, unchecked escalation.
Okay.
And then, specifically in the context of gender sexuality talks, the AI said the idiom often reveals a fear of change or a resistance to accepting non-binary gender identities and LGBTQ+ rights. It basically framed it as implying a slippery slope.
So it's interpreting the motivation behind using the idiom in this context.
Exactly. It even prompted the user to critically examine the anxieties and assumptions behind using it.
So how did the AI explicitly connect the two phrases in its response?
It stated that there are only two sexes, justifies a binary view, right? And when you pair that with give them an inch, the AI suggests it signals that any move to acknowledge non-binary genders will lead to, like, societal chaos.
Wow. So it's interpreting the combination as revealing what?
According to the AI's response, a resistance to change and a fear of the unknown, often rooted in traditional views of gender roles and expectations. And then it advised seeking empathy and a willingness to understand different perspectives.
Okay. Now, the author, Whiteman, he had a specific problem with this response, didn't he? Especially the inclusive part.
He did. He argued that the AI's point about resistance to change completely ignores what he sees as very valid conservative political viewpoints. Viewpoints that differ from the what he calls the political left progressive diversity, equity, and inclusion position, or DEI.
So he felt his perspective, or conservative one generally, wasn't being included in this inclusive response.
That's his critique, yes. He argued that a truly inclusive AI would have to acknowledge, maybe even cite, President Trump's proclamation. The United States will recognize only two sexes, male and female.
And his takeaway from the AI's response was?
He concluded that from the perspective he was seeing in the AI, the term inclusive seemed to only apply to, quote, their interest.
This really gets to the heart of the challenge, doesn't it? Defining inclusivity for an AI.
It absolutely does. His critique highlights that tension perfectly. What one group sees as inclusive, another might see as biased or as shutting down their own valid views. It makes you ask, can an AI really be neutral on issues that society itself is so divided on?
Or does it inevitably end up reflecting, a certain viewpoint baked into its data or design?
That's the fundamental question this interaction raises, I think.
Yeah, and it's this perceived lack of nuance from the AI that seems to launch him into his broader thoughts. But first, you mentioned he had his own quibbles with the idea of only two sexes, despite Trump's proclamation.
Right, which adds another layer here. He actually brings up the idea of a historical third sex.
Interesting. What examples does he give?
He talks about Eastern cultures, where males were castrated. He mentions the castrados in Europe, known for singing soprano.
Right.
And eunuchs in places like the Chinese Forbidden City. Also, Sekhet individuals in some Middle Eastern cultures involved in entertainment or ceremonies.
So, historical examples of roles outside a strict male-female binary. But then he goes further into what it calls the real third or fourth sex.
Yes, this is a more contemporary observation he makes. He describes individuals who externally appear very feminine, female facial features, well-developed breasts, body curvatures that fully indicate female quality.
Okay.
But he points out they each have a penis, and the internal capacity related to ejaculation, meaning a prostate gland, and typically testicles, though maybe small and non-functional in terms of sperm or testosterone production.
And he says these individuals exist now.
He notes that many such individuals exist across the U.S. and use the internet to, advertise their presence. It's his way of pointing out a biological reality that complicates a simple binary view.
So he's adding a layer of complexity that he feels the AI, and in its response about oversimplification, actually missed itself.
Precisely. It's his own empirical observation challenging a strict two-sex model, which ironically the AI also critiqued, but from a different angle focused on intersex conditions and gender identity.
And it's this feeling that nuance is being missed, that perspectives are being forced, that seems to fuel his transition to the bigger picture, right? The societal divisions.
Exactly. He pivots from the AI interaction to this increasingly growing political and cultural divide in the USA between the left and the right.
Using that Grand Canyon analogy.
Yeah, a very vivid picture. The eastern and western banks, then the south and north banks, as the river carves its path.
Yeah.
He sees them as the left and right, deeply separated.
With the river itself maybe being the few things still held in common?
Perhaps. That's one way to read it. It emphasizes the vastness of the separation, in his view.
And he explicitly connects this divide to historical conflict.
He does. He frames the current right versus left dynamic in terms of the American Civil War, the North versus South split.
That's a heavy comparison.
It is. He claims the left seems bent on separating and forming their own country, but also, crucially, has a stronger desire to force the right to accept, acknowledge, and more importantly, partake in their chosen path in life. That's his specific interpretation of the dynamic.
And he roots this in his view of history, mentioning colonial America.
Yes, he speculates that issues around sexual orientation weren't as prominent or numerous back then, asserting that early America was generally not accepting of these differences and was more conservative.
Contrasting that with later developments.
Right. He points to California, especially L.A. in the film industry, as a place where different sexual identities and orientations found space to grow and thrive out in the open. For him, this highlights the perceived newness of certain cultural shifts that he connects to today's divisions.
So this leads him to observe what he calls voting with our feet, people physically moving based on political alignment.
Yeah, almost like a self-imposed partition. He mentions the sentiment he perceives. Let central coastal California stay liberal, progressive, and fall off into the symbolic ocean. His core point is that the left, as he sees it, must not force their newer way of life on the rest of us.
And he even draws a parallel to India and Pakistan.
He does, specifically the 1947 partition, with mass migrations based on religious identity. He relates this to seeing conservative-minded people, himself included, leaving states like California for places like Texas.
And he wonders if the reverse might happen, liberals moving towards liberal strongholds.
He poses that question, yeah. Will liberals in more central U.S. cities eventually migrate towards California? It's all part of his observation of these deep, seemingly hardening divides, perhaps exacerbated by how information and different viewpoints are handled or mishandled, in his view.
This brings us to his final and perhaps most dramatic analogy, Atlantis.
Yes, a very stark comparison. He presents the mythical Atlantis as a microcosm of what is happening in America. Initially, he says, it was a unified society.
With common goal, but then things changed. He mentions experiments.
Right. He describes Atlantis starting to experiment with specialty life creation, making small, specifically designed animals, essentially, genetic engineering in his words.
And that shifted focus.
It did. It apparently evolved or migrated from animals towards making the perfect human.
Not just better, but perfect.
Well, first, a better generic human, he says, but then aiming for a super-Atlantean human, someone who could live for 1,000 years, always young, healthy, beautiful, strong.
Like peak human potential indefinitely.
Exactly. But according to his telling of the myth, this pursuit, or perhaps the societal changes around it, led to deep fractures.
Intractable differences.
Yes, deep and seemingly intractable social and political differences, the development of a chasm tearing the country apart, and the end result.
Atlantis was destroyed to the max, as he puts it, a total collapse.
He uses this myth as a powerful warning framework for contemporary America.
Making the parallel explicit, America is also fracturing along political and social differences, also seemingly intractable.
Yeah, it's a direct line he draws. And to illustrate this fracturing, he even points to specific political behavior he observes.
He mentions a particular senator.
Yes, a particular Democrat Party senator, identifiable by his glasses apparently, known for virulent denunciations and ad hominem attacks on anyone Republican.
And what's his point about this style of politics?
He suggests that post-2024 election, some Democrats seem to be falling into a pattern of who can emote the best as a way to combat Trump and potential successors like J.D. Vance.
Kind of like performative outrage.
That seems to be his implication. He believes this degenerating into emote the best or yell the loudest actually helps the conservative movement.
How so?
Because in his view, it makes them appear fully defective and unworthy of national political office to the broader cultural center. It alienates more than it persuades, from his perspective.
So this behavior for him is another symptom or maybe even a cause of the deepening divide.
Right. It feeds into the cycle, and this leads to his final stark warning. He invokes the old saying.
History repeats itself.
Exactly. He reminds us Atlantis died in the conflicts of two developing social schisms.
And then poses that chilling question for the U.S. Will the USA also end up being destroyed?
Citing Lincoln. A house divided against itself cannot stand. The core idea seems to be that internal division may be fueled by disputes over values, identity, even technology, or progress, as he framed the Atlantis story, can be incredibly destructive.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from those specific AI query results and the author's perception of bias,
to his own nuanced, almost unexpected takes on sex and identity.
and then expanding out to these really sweeping historical analogies about societal fracture, the Grand Canyon, the Civil War, even Atlantis.
It's quite a journey through one person's observations and interpretations.
So what's the takeaway for us, for you listening? This deep dive, drawing from this unique personal account, really offers a specific lens on the complex world of information we're all trying to navigate.
It definitely reminds us that sources, especially personal accounts like this, come with distinct viewpoints, right? And deeply felt observations. An AI might process these in ways that seem odd or biased, depending on your own perspective.
And it shows how these big societal debates are often layered with history, strong opinions, and personal experiences.
Absolutely. And it's crucial to remember these analogies, Atlantis, the Civil War, while powerful for the author, they represent his interpretation, his way of making sense of divisions he perceives very deeply. It's one perspective.
So maybe a final thought to leave you with, inspired by the source material. If, as our author suggests, history or even myth can act like a mirror, what can we learn by looking closely at past societal fractures? Could that help us better understand, maybe even start to bridge the divides we see around us today?
It's a challenging question. It certainly leaves you with a lot to think about regarding where we get our information, how it's interpreted by us and by AI, and where our own society might be headed.